What's up, everybody? This is episode 46 of An Untold Narrative featuring the lovely Sarah. And I honestly have no idea how to say your last name, so I'm just going to allow you to do it.
No worries. Sarah Sukumaran.
Sukumaran?
Mm-hmm. I'm probably saying that wrong too. It's actually, Sukumaran is like actually how you say the name. But yeah, I don't actually say it that way.
I'm super happy I didn't give that a go. But thanks for being here. You are the co-founder or just the founder? Just the founder of Lilith NYC. So thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, super cool. So if you were to give, or if you're on the train, and I think you're New York City based, if you're on the train and somebody asks you what you do, what's your 30-second elevator pitch about yourself?
So lately I'm a founder of a women's sneaker company based in Queens, New York. Prior to that, it'd probably be more of a tech spiel, but.
Wait, give everybody the tech spiel.
So I just tell them I work in data analytics, and I've always just had a career in startups, and it's primarily been just analyzing data for different startups.
This is just my opinion. That doesn't sound as exciting.
No, it does. It isn't. It wasn't.
So you mentioned you're based in New York. Have you always, are you born there? Are you raised there? Kind of what's your kind of back history?
Yeah, born and raised in Queens, New York. I'm actually living in a different part of Queens at the moment, but was born in Elmhurst, now in Jackson Heights. But my parents moved in the 80s. They were refugees, Tamil refugees, but they settled in Queens. So that's where I've been.
Refugees from where?
Sri Lanka.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool.
Yeah, in the 80s. So there was a civil war. I would say probably a lot of Tamils probably reside like in Canada, in Toronto, in Europe. My father had a wild story. He actually ended up in Germany, where a lot of people were actually seeking refugee status. And then he made his way to New York vis-a-vis Mexico, crossing the Mexico-US border by foot, and then hopping on a plane from Texas, and he headed to LaGuardia. He had his heart set on New York, I guess.
Holy cow. Okay.
Wild story. Yeah.
Yeah. What a story. Well, thankful that he did all that, right?
Absolutely. I couldn't imagine myself, I think, being raised elsewhere. Like, I feel like Queens is just so like just home, you know? And so quite amazing how we ended up there because everyone else is in Canada, like all of my extended family, Canada or Europe. So.
Gotcha. Have you had an opportunity to visit Sri Lanka?
Yeah, actually, 2011. I mean, I went back in 87 because of green card issues. That was kind of crazy, that situation there. And then it wasn't until 2011 that I kind of went back with my mother. I told her, like, listen, I'm going any which way. You can join me or not, but I'm going. So we did that trip. So that was her first time back after probably whatever, since like 1987 at that point. And my father just went back for the first time, 2020, he retired. And he and my mom actually went back for retirement. They're back in New York now, but that was the first time after like 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah, crazy.
Okay, well that's a great opener. We went through a roller coaster of history there. So
right.
that was cool. So how come you've never like really left New York then? Like, I'm assuming you've traveled a little bit.
Yeah.
But like you seem to always go back to your roots.
Always in New York. Yeah, I actually left for college. So in university, I went to Babson College. It's 20 minutes outside of Boston. You know this, in the town of Wellesley. So for 4 years, I was outside of New York. But on the weekends, I'd take the Fanghua bus back straight to New York. You know about the Fanghua bus.
Oh my God. Yeah. I took the Greyhound from Boston to Hartford, Connecticut. Because my parents live in Connecticut. So yeah. I know it well.
Yeah. So a lot of us New Yorkers would just like take that bus. It was super cheap. It was like $1 if you can get it on a good day. And then, would just make my way home often on the weekends. But yeah, so apart from that, mainly in New York, I had traveled quite a bit for work. So I was at SAP for a short while, for 3 years, and I would travel to London and Munich. They had offices there and I had teams there. So would travel quite a bit then. And then just personal travel. I'm always on a plane.
Yeah. Well, let's back it up to Babson. Like, one, how did you get into Babson? What did you study there? How did you make that decision?
Yeah. my career choices are just interesting. I just knew I wanted to study business, and actually I kind of rewind. So I went to a high school in Queens. It was actually Catholic school. I did a lot of Catholic school, like 13 years of it. Archbishop Malloy was the high school that I went to. It was actually all boys when I entered. So I was part of the first co-ed class. I think I was actually on a track for like pre-med was what I was interested in. But then I think senior year, I kind of just like pulled the trigger and was like, actually, I'm going to flip the switch and go like, business. And so I had asked the career guidance counselor at the time to say like, what are like the top business schools to go to? And so Babson actually came up as like the number one for entrepreneurship. I knew at some point in my life, I wanted to start my own business. Ended up getting in. And so that's how I actually ended up in Babson. It was a very like last minute decision senior year that I was not going to do pre-med and I was wanting to go into business school. And so Babson's a little different. So you can actually, it's a 4-year business program. So you're not having to do 2 years of electives and then you kind of declare your major your junior year. You're actually taking business classes. You're running your own business like from the first day. So really unique experience in that way. So that's kind of how
you knew you wanted to be or start your own business even back in high school?
I just knew that I don't know. I felt like I didn't know what I wanted to do, to be honest. I think I grew up in a household that really pushed medicine. My parents were both healthcare workers. And I think just immigrant parents, you probably know this, they know engineering, they know medicine, those traditional routes, and it's all about financial security, right? So that they're like, if you get this job, you're going to be financially secure, you can buy your own place. And so when they heard business, they were like, well, what do you do with a business degree? They're like, what is that end goal that you're going to do? And so they were quite confused on what I was planning to do with my life and like starting my own business, but they were like, whatever, like you did well so far, like we trust you, go do what you're going to do. But to be honest, I think going to Babson, I really wanted to get into consulting. So you probably know, like people end up working for Accenture or like KPMG, whether you're in the accounting field or strategic consulting. So I thought like just based on how I was proceeding at college, consulting just fit my background. Like I was very strategic. I like, working with businesses to kind of figure out like future planning and all of that stuff. So I thought that was honestly where I was going to go at least post-graduation. I graduated in 2008, which is the financial crisis. And so things just very quickly changed in terms of like just job opportunities or just anything at that point. Yeah, it was insane.
How did your parents feel about that business degree during that time?
Exactly. So like so I actually ended up after graduation taking a fellowship in India and was teaching entrepreneurship curriculum and kind of designing entrepreneurship curriculum in Hubli, which is like a city in like southern India.
Seriously?
Yeah. So that was like 2009. And so they were like, okay, so you're not really using your degree. So they were just like, okay, obviously this is a crazy time for you. Go do what you're going to do. Because I went off to India and was working there because I was actually interning for the city of New York, NYC EDC for a bit. That was an internship like post-college. Like they just weren't able to take me on full time. And then I got this fellowship in India. So I actually went off there.
Were you seeking out fellowships like on a global level, or like how did you like stumble into like you stumble into like living in India and teaching business?
Yeah. So in college, despite having that interest in business, I was super interested in like post-colonial studies. I was taking classes around, revolutions in Latin America. So I had a very liberal arts background as well. And so international development was something that I was also looking at from like a consulting strategic perspective. There's a ton of different firms. And so that was honestly what saved me at Babson. I felt so out of place because a lot of my peers in business school came from high schools that actually taught them accounting, taught them finance. And my high school didn't really prep us for that kind of education. So I really felt like freshman, sophomore year, I felt really out of place, which is why I was on the Fung Law bus back home. Like I just didn't feel like anything was clicking on campus. And it wasn't probably until like sophomore, junior year where I kind of found those liberal art courses where I kind of fell into place like human rights and post-colonial studies, that I kind of like understood the balance between humanities, arts and humanities, as well as like the business world. And so post-graduation, my plan was either go into consulting world or something that had to do with like international relations or development. And so I had been seeking out like both strictly business jobs at like the big consulting firms, as well as dabbling, throwing applications at some of these international companies. And so that's actually how I ended up getting that fellowship.
Wild.
Yeah.
And how long were you in India for?
A short while. I actually quit. The dude was a misogynist. I couldn't handle it. I was just like, I quit a couple of months in. Just didn't get on with folks. Yeah, it was just a mess. Like, I feel like international development, realizing today, like how, yeah, I mean, I can go into it, but just like, I feel like you think you're doing things right, but like, you know, people aren't listening to the folks on the ground. Like, you come in, it's just kind of like pseudo neo-colonialist in your own way. And so, it just didn't make sense. And then I returned back to New York.
What do you think, and just to push it a tiny bit further, like what's like the biggest thing that you learned in like those 2 months, 3 months, from whatever it was that you were there? Like, that's such a unique experience.
Yeah.
So to India, of all, like, I'll visit one day for sure, because I want the culture shock, but like everything I see and hear and people talk about it, it's like wildly different.
Right.
So what's like something that you learned from that?
So it was actually, I think it was around 6 months that I actually stayed there. I think the biggest thing, I think being an American, I think we're often kind of like parachuted into these countries to give advice or strategy, or when the reality is there's so many people on the ground, locals, who are literally saying the same thing that's coming out of my mouth, but no one's putting their ideas on a pedestal. And so that's kind of where I noticed the conflict, where literally there's this amazing staff on the ground who you should be listening to, but you're listening to the American because maybe she has this Babson degree or whatever, you know? And so that kind of felt out of place and wrong, because it just felt more of that colonial structure that India has still kind of continues, right? Where it's very just stratified society. And so I just felt like it just wasn't working out in that sense. But in terms of learning, I think travel in general just opens your eyes into like how communities express themselves, like, you know, whatever trauma they've been through, or whatever influencers that they're having to kind of adapt to. So for example, this place, it was actually a tech billionaire who was investing in his hometown in terms of infrastructure and entrepreneurship, and he was a tech entrepreneur himself, and so investing a lot of money into building up that society. So it was just interesting to see how you have this very rural industrial community that then has this massive entrepreneurship center being built out. And what are those implications for those people? Which is amazing, because, you know, we work with dairy farmers who are getting set up with just formal structures and being able to actually make a profit. And so there was a lot of good being done on the ground, but I think just for me, I felt out of place in terms of just the way certain things were going about it. And just, you should just be listening to the people on the ground, right? Like, you really don't need Sarah to come in and parachute in and kind of throw her ideas, right? And so that's kind of why I had to pull back a little bit.
Isn't that like, that's on a global scale, but it's so relatable to even day-to-day businesses here in America too. It's like
100%.
Companies and corporations just don't want to listen to the workers on the ground floor when they're
Right.
going through the mud and the dirt
Right.
every day, and they probably have good solutions to the problems. They 100%. Just don't listen.
Yeah. I mean, I worked in customer success for a long time at startups, and that was one of the biggest challenges, is like, you don't listen to your own staff who are at the front lines of hearing the voice of the customer, right? And so, yeah, it's absolutely on a global scale as well as companies here. But yeah, it was an amazing learning experience for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's wild. That's cool that you got to do that, at least for a little bit. And so you come back, you mentioned you working at SAP for a little bit.
So a little prior to that, I was actually at Experian Cheetah Mail, which is an email marketing company. And that's kind of where, so basically you send emails on behalf of your clients, you design, you QA, all of that, you code it. So my clients were like American Eagle, I think DirecTV at some point. And so basically working on as an account management team to help guide their teams on like email marketing strategy. And that's actually where it got a little technical. I'd have to actually like code up the emails, you know, your HTML skills that you learn from your MySpace days come into handy. And so that's kind of like where the career started. And so from there, I actually jumped ship to another email marketing company, but that was a startup. And that was super technical. There, I was able to kind of shadow a lot of the devs and engineers, again, working in customer success, but actually kind of also wearing a product management hat. So product management are the folks who kind of design the software and roll out the features based on the customer feedback. So I was doing a little bit of that. And that was like the product itself was for devs by devs, essentially. So it was a very technical version of the previous company, because developers were really the ones implementing the service. And so that's really where I kind of like really fell into like the tech world and startup scene in New York. And then from there went to another startup, Giraffe, which was e-commerce analytics, where I kind of like was director of product, managed the whole design of this e-commerce analytics suite. We worked with Shopify platform, SAP Hybris, Magento, and that's when SAP, I think I was there for 2 years in that role before SAP acquired us. And then I was at SAP for 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, SAP is like one of the biggest companies in that space today, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, SAP Hybris is their e-commerce platform. So that's kind of like the sector that I went into in terms of the acquisition. And that's why I was traveling to London and Munich so often, like on a monthly basis.
That's okay. I know nothing about that space. Obviously, it's highly important and regarded today because everything's done through e-com, right? Like transactions, customers hearing what they say, understanding the product, shipping things, like it's all involved today, regardless of what product you're using or utilizing. So how did you, I'm assuming after SAP, you landed at Nike.
Yes.
If I understand your career path. So what was like the highlight or low light even of why you left SAP? Was it just not fulfilling, or did you reach like kind of, it sounds like you had a very quick projection north, right? It sounds like you were doing the groundwork, you had a director level job, SAP acquired, you were taking on larger responsibilities, you're traveling. What made you want to jump ship to something new?
So I think at that point, I was actually quite happy at SAP. It was actually a pretty good job. We were still working on the same product that we had gotten acquired. We were just adapting it for the SAP consumer base. I just think I just got kind of tired of working on the same product, because you kind of get siloed. You're like, hey, like, this is why we hired you. You're going to still build. And at that point, I was probably working on that for 5 years, the same product. And in the tech world, I mean, things are constantly changing. And so I think it was just me itching for something new. But the time at SAP was great. I think what was lovely there was that everyone came from a tech background. So everyone, it wasn't kind of like having a different conversation at all. Like everyone was on the same page about what they did. The traveling was also awesome. I was able to go to London and Munich and kind of interact with my colleagues there. So I actually wasn't really, I was kind of applying and throwing things out, but it wasn't like, oh, I need to get out of SAP at all. Nike actually reached out to me, a recruiter reached out. And interestingly, Nike at the time had just made a tech startup acquisition. So similar to the way SAP acquired Giraffe, the company that I was head of product at, they had just made an analytics acquisition. And they were like, hey, like we need a head of product to come in to kind of redesign this platform that was called Zodiac for our needs, for Nike's needs. And so that was really, I think they had saw from my LinkedIn or whatever, my profile, that I had that experience of taking a small startup company and kind of embedding it in a larger corporation, and having stayed there for like 3 years. So that's kind of how that whole Nike situation came about.
Yeah, super cool. I didn't know they acquired somebody.
They've done like quite a few now. It's 21 now, so I think like 3 or 4 under their belt. Wow. Different tech startups, yeah.
And what year was that, just for context?
2018. Yeah, so they contacted me probably like the summer of 2018. I think like the spring of 2018, they may have made that acquisition. And
so you came in to Nike as head of product. Were you still based New York based, or did you move out to Portland?
Yeah, I was on a plane out. I was still based in the New York office because that tech startup was based out of Philly and New York. So they kind of had a split office situation. But I think as soon as I signed, I had to be on a plane to PDX. Like I was out in Portland before I even like signed the paperwork. So I actually spent quite a bit. I feel like the first quarter or 2 quarters, I was in Portland every month for meetings. Yeah.
And how long were you there? Because it sounds like it was a couple of years, maybe 3 years or so. 2
years at Nike, just under 2 years.
Okay, and I'm going to reposition the same question as before.
Yeah.
So that's even a shorter stint than at SAP. So what was like the best part of the job? Mm-hmm. Was it the same problem of like, I got put into a bucket and I'm working on just this kind of product and problem solving, or like?
I think it was a little different. Like honestly, like I think I'll rewind a little bit. Like Nike was kind of a dream job situation because I had always been a sneakerhead growing up in Queens, but never thought of even applying to jobs. Like it was never on my radar to apply to a job at Adidas or Nike because I just had this boring tech career and I was like, I just need to apply to my tech startups or even corporations. But like the footwear industry was just not in my line of sight. And so when they reached out to me and the fact that it was a data job, I was like, absolutely, like sign me up. So I was like super stoked to be on board. And the first couple of months were amazing. Like we moved very quickly to take the product that team had built originally and adapt it for the Nike base. So I was in Portland, Maine, actually to interview all of the internal stakeholders, whether they were in the finance org, whether they were in merchandising, marketing, global membership, which is like the Nike Plus membership, and all of this. And so it was just a bunch of just kind of getting face-to-face time with people in the PDX offices and like understanding how they need to use this data. Because something that's interesting about Nike is that like in all of these legacy footwear companies is that they've been in the wholesale business for 40, 50 years, right? So they've had to rely on the Foot Lockers and Foot Actions and the mom and pop shops to understand who their consumers are. Like Nike really doesn't know who they're, now they do, but prior to that, they didn't know David as a consumer. They didn't know his quirks and what he liked about anything. That was really left up to the middleman. And so they were on this journey. I think prior to that acquisition, they announced their consumer direct offense strategy, which is we're kind of moving away from the wholesale strategy. We're going to sell direct to our consumers on our e-commerce sites, in store, really so that we can kind of get that data set. So that was kind of what pushed that acquisition. And so for me, the first couple of months, quarters, year was really just kind of understanding the workflow of users internally at Nike. Like, how do they use data? Are they comfortable using data? What drives their business making decisions? How can I take like your Excel file and make it into something in the cloud, right? And so those are the conversations we're having, which absolutely up my alley and what I'm used to doing in building and product management. But I think for me, I think I just work at startup space, right? We're deploying startups, you deploy code daily, hourly, at the every minute, or constantly deploying. And I felt like the speed at Nike was just a little bit slower. Like you would have to wait a quarter before you can like release this report. And I'm like, well, the data's stale now, right? The data, like if you're not looking at your data now and getting it out the door, it's stale, right? And so I think for me, a few things, like I just felt like things moved a bit slowly. And that's no fault of Nike's.
Totally.
Nike's like a huge company where they're only understanding data strategy today, right? Their employees are understanding how to become more data literate, how to employ KPIs to drive some of the decision making. Before, like if you approach a marketing team, they'd actually like hate having to talk to me because they're like, no, because now Sarah's coming in being like, here's a KPI to measure your budget, and I don't want to do that anymore. And so understandably so, I think there needs to be a shift in mindset in terms of how to move forward in a data world now that they have it, now that they're doing the consumer direct strategy. And so for me, I just felt like it was just moving a bit slow. And like I mentioned earlier, I'd always wanted to start my own company. And 2015 actually was when I wanted to do something in the startup in the footwear space. I was at Giraffe at the company right before SAP. And it was there where I wanted to do something in the women's footwear space. I was shopping for footwear and couldn't get anything like in my size. The shopping experience was really bulky and just really hard to kind of curate. And 2015 was actually when I started like, I created the Instagram account for Lilith. I created the website, I bought the domain, sat on it, didn't do anything with it. So that was really when.
You were so early.
Yeah, but I didn't do anything.
2 questions.
Yeah.
Why not? and then I want to loop back to just poking at Nike one more time.
Yeah.
What was your biggest success while you were there? So first, why did you sit? Well, we'll keep Lilith real quick. Like why?
Yeah.
Why did you sit on it for so long? And then, what do you think your biggest like success or takeaway from Nike was?
I'll start with the second question, I guess. The biggest success, I think, was just being able to ramp up on understanding how people work at Nike. I think that's just part of my background, like working in tech. I'm able to very quickly synthesize like the data structure and, where the data is living to kind of create these dashboards and basically call in data from different databases. Like I can't even tell you how many different places data was flowing from, right? Because again, they're a wholesale business, their back-end system, and it's coordinating with various tech organizations within Nike to make sure the data is coming in correctly. So I think we were able, I think within 2 quarters, we had our dashboard up and running. Like it was flowing data, people were logging in, the marketing and membership teams were actually looking at our data. So like to me, that was a big success, is that I had tracking on it. So I knew who was logging in. I can see people actually using it. And we were kind of very much, we made a shift from people utilizing Excel sheets to actually like proactively logging in every day to look at the data that was flowing in, that was getting updated in real time. And so for me, that I would say that's kind of like the biggest success, right? Because someone's actually using the product you've designed for their day-to-day decision-making, right? They're going into a Monday meeting being like, okay, well, here's what the data is telling us. Here's who we need to target or how we need to think about this cohort of folks, consumers. So like, I didn't say this, but the platform basically predicts future cash flow for Nike based on the previous consumers' transaction history and behaviors.
This is like this stuff I know nothing about, but it kind of blows my brain out of my face a little bit, because it's like that last statement of like it predicts cash flow based on
it's pretty big
consumer analytics is wild.
Right.
Like they know what we're doing before we do it.
Essentially, yes, because that's predictive analytics for you. Yeah, and I feel like it's Nikes and Adidas are kind of playing catch up to this world, because for me, this was so nascent. 10, 15 years ago, I was helping clients do this. And I feel like with the footwear industry, where they've never had to sell direct to David or to Sarah, now they're having to figure that out. And so now this is so new to them, like, okay, well, we have this 10-year data set. How do we leverage this to better get folks to consume and to purchase? So yeah, it's amazing seeing people's behavior shift. So
today with Lilith, like, you know who's already pre-ordered all your shoes and everything like that. Like you already know if I'm going to buy another pair later on.
I haven't started. You need a lot of data for those type of algorithms. So at some point I will definitely have something similar in place, but it's going to take us time to get there.
Okay. Now let's loop back, because now we're entering the infancy of Lilith, right? Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you had the idea for a long time. What took so long to actually get going? Yeah.
I think in 2015, I was definitely just frustrated. I was just like, there's got to be a better way. I was reading tons of articles about how obviously women were spending more than men, but obviously there wasn't a shift from these companies in terms of how they were selling to women. Again, I was also in the e-commerce analytics space at that time. So I knew, like, Nasty Gal, for example, was a company that was massive, and they were obviously focused on the women consumer. So I just like hearing all these companies come out and focusing on women, I was like, why hasn't the footwear industry really shifted, right? Because up until that point, I'm still shopping in the men's section. I'm still getting pushed into grade school sizing, right? If I want like a high heat release. And so in 2015, that was still my like kind of lived experience. The first idea I had was to kind of create like kind of a curation where I would just pull all of the women's footwear onto a single site, so it's an easier shopping experience.
Sure.
The second idea was just to actually have a store, but you can't have just an e-commerce store. At the time, Nikes of the world would actually require you to have a brick and mortar presence as well to have an account with them.
A requirement?
Yeah, I think so.
Wow.
When I was doing research, I was like, okay, there's no way, because I have no money. I have like.
That's wild.
Yeah. And so like, I just felt like it just wasn't something I can achieve at that point in my life. And at the same time, we were, as a startup, going through this acquisition process. So I was just crazy busy, like dealing with this whole SAP, and like there was other people that we were possibly trying to get sold to as well. So.
But that first idea that you mentioned, and you could tell me if I'm off base, that concept is what I think it's called Common Ace.
Common Ace, yeah, it's what Sophia is doing, which is amazing, because we still need that, right? Like we still need a platform like Common Ace.
That was that idea, except back in 2015.
Right.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
it's crazy how long it's taken for the industry to shift, isn't it?
And I think it's because as women consumers too, we're just so accustomed to, shopping in the children's section or having to just like deal with the leftover inventory or just getting pushed elsewhere. It's just it's taken a while, and I'm so glad that Sophia and Romy are working on Common Ace, because it's still a need, right? Like we definitely need better curation. We need to have like the equivalent of whatever male or men's shopping experience for women, right? There's so many strides to be made there. But I think coming out of Nike, where my mind kind of shifted away from that e-commerce experience, was just like footwear to begin with. I was realizing that like when I look back at the shoes I wore, it was always a takedown of a men's version, right? Like the performance tooling was stripped out. There's no airbag in the kids version of a shoe. Obviously kids are churning out of their shoes, right? But why are women having to wear those same children's shoes? We're not churning out of our, our size is the same, but we're having to spend money and to use those shoes. And so for me, I was just like, okay, well, if I'm not going to do this online curation site, maybe I just create footwear where we're focusing on actually like addressing the woman's foot, addressing the issues maybe with arch support, addressing the fact that performance tooling has been historically stripped out of the shoe. And then the biggest thing that you obviously hear is the size run. I wear women's 7, but I know tons of women that wear like women's 5, right? And so at that point, you're having to shop in the kids section. But our feet aren't kids' feet, right? Like they're actually mature and they're in a place where like we're not growing anymore. And so we do need performance built in.
What a crazy concept.
What a crazy concept, right? It's so foreign. And so that's kind of where I landed with just, you know what, Lilith is actually going to be building footwear from scratch for women, as opposed to doing this curation site, which is again still needed.
What's the time period that you left Nike to divert all of your attention and focus into Lilith?
So I made the crazy decision to quit Nike right before the pandemic. So I gave notice. I was like, awesome. I think I gave notice like April. So I gave them like 4 weeks notice, a month, because I had like a lot of stuff I had to offload. And then March happened. Like my last date was my last date was like March 2nd is what they put in the system. And then right around the corner was the pandemic. So I had no idea.
God.
And there was whispers actually from my colleagues in China that something was happening.
Yeah.
Right. People were getting sick. And I actually got really sick.
You heard whispers like in December and January, and then, but like everybody was like,
Right. So I actually got sick. So I went to Portland in December 2019 and I got really sick coming back. Like I lost my sense of taste. And I just thought I was really sick and I couldn't I have asthma, but I was sitting on the couch, like just moving left, moving right. I was out of breath. So I go to the urgent care because my family's like, because it was holidays. My parents like, you're definitely sick. Like you need to get this checked. And they're like, oh, you have acute bronchitis. I'm pretty sure that was an early case of COVID because if you remember, the nursing homes in Portland were really the ones that kind of got hit with COVID, right? Especially proximity to China. So I'm convinced I brought COVID to New York in December of 2019, but who knows?
Those are your words, not mine.
Right.
What? Yeah, I mean, you just don't know, right?
Yeah.
It's but that is crazy. And at that time, nobody knew. You just think it's just a traditional sickness. So
right.
So during the pandemic, you were working every day from home like everybody else, except on this startup.
Yeah. So in March 2020, I decided to hire a branding company as well as someone to do like the design or like the ethos of the brand, as well as footwear development team to kind of start working on the designs. Foolishly, I thought the footwear design stuff would kind of be really quick. Like someone's like, oh, just hire a designer, you get a tech pack and you get moving, you find your factory and it's gonna be all really quick. So that took longer than expected. Obviously, it's definitely a process.
But was it because you had a specific vision for what it would look like, or was it just the process itself?
I think I think I had a couple of ideas in terms of what I wanted in the footwear, like what I definitely wanted to emphasize, which was like the size run, the performance tooling, and just more premium materials getting used in the shoe. So those were kind of like my 3 requirements. Cool. In terms of the design, I think I realized that there's a lot more like storytelling, like, what are those influences? Like kind of like peeling back the layers of the onion about like growing up in Queens, like what were the kicks that I grew up with? I wore a lot of Air Max 95s and Air Max Pluses. But I also wanted to wear like the foam posits and because that's what all the guys had, but they would look so bulky on my feet. Like there was just no way. And so we kind of went through this entire exercise of like understanding like what were those influences early on to kind of like where are we going to land on the shoe going forward. So that took quite a bit of while.
Gotcha. So pretty much you, in a year more or less, you started Lilith from scratch, because you launched the product, if I'm correct, January or February of 21.
January, we did the soft launch, we did the pre-orders. Yep. And that was great. And we also had merchandise. We had like hoodies and tees for folks, and that was amazing. Like everyone came out to support.
What was like the biggest challenge launching it? I mean, obviously in a pandemic, and this is before they kind of soft reopened the country even, right? So what was like the biggest challenge throughout that year leading up to the launch? Or was it successful in your eyes because you understood how to launch something via e-commerce?
Yeah, I definitely think the e-commerce experience helps. I think the biggest challenge though was definitely the manufacturing, hands down, because we had started off saying we're going to work in China, and then very quickly China went offline in those early months of 2020. Like no one, like they had stay-at-home orders, like they were a complete lockdown. So then we went to Portugal, and we're having conversations there to see if that made sense. But then Portugal got really hit bad, like along with Spain. So that kind of we were still moving along on the footwear design process, but actually getting something into the factory and starting that process was on like just in a standstill. And then finally we ended up back in China, because they kind of bounced back, because Asia, I feel like Asia just knows how to ride out pandemics at this point, right? It's the rest of us that are trying to figure it all out. So
it's the truth.
They just absolutely were just like, yeah, everything's back to normal, we're good.
No, I know even at work, like our counterparts, like they definitely shut down, they locked down. Nobody moved. They figured it out,
right?
And they're back.
It's what we should have done.
Yeah.
In the U.S.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. So the manufacturing side, and I know just talking with you offline that that's still today one of the biggest challenges, because one, we're still in the pandemic, essentially, and like trying to get the product into New York City now that you finalize the design, you approve the samples and things like that.
Yeah, I think the global supply chain definitely got hit, right? Like, and then you had all of these, like the ocean freight issues in the Suez Canal, like just like shipping. I think overall though, if you look at my case specifically, I do have a smaller MOQ than probably most other folks would, right? Because I am a smaller company. I didn't want to have a ton of inventory. I wanted to kind of prove out, like, are people going to fall in love with this design? Are they going to purchase it, rather than house a ton of inventory in New York, right? So I think having, finding the right partner factory is probably another one of the biggest challenges, especially when you're starting out, because no one really wants to take that bet on someone who has a small MOQ. So I would say like you can add that to the list on top of just like the COVID manufacturing issues.
Yeah. This is maybe more so a question that just like popped into my brain, and maybe it's just more so for myself, but like, how did you fund the project? Is it just your years of working in the workforce and you've just slowly incrementally been saving money, or are you fully self-funded? Like, how is that process working for you? Is everything out of pocket, all the different samples?
It is. Yeah, it's self-funded. So I, prior to me ever having a dream of Lilith, I actually wanted to like buy a place finally. Like I had taken, true immigrant story, you take care of your parents, like help them with their house in New York. And then I actually, my sister and I helped build my parents' house back in Sri Lanka so that they can retire and like spend 6 months.
Wow. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So that's actually where they were for the last 8 months. They were actually in that house. It's like my grandfather actually built it. And then it was just like after, like no one occupied it during the war. And so it just like was falling apart. And so to make it livable, like habitable again, we had to like do a ton of repairs. And so I feel like I spent so much, I always say this, like so much, like taking care of them. But like at this point, I was just like, you know what, I'm going to have a major regret. And that's part of why I quit Nike too. It's like, if I don't do this now, I'm going to sleep. Like anytime I see an article about women's sneakers, I'm just going to be like, you have that feeling in your stomach. Like, why wasn't it me? Like, why didn't I do this? And so decided to take all the savings that I had to buy my own house and put it towards this. So I'm still self-funded. I kind of entertained the idea of doing, like VC funding or like external funding, but I just put that off. Like I wanted just to get the footwear out the door and see how the market responded before like trying to get external funding.
Are you happy with that decision, or you don't know yet?
No, 100%. Because I actually spoke to a ton of founders about how like as soon as you take external funding, like the dynamic changes, right? Like there's insane growth metrics that you need to begin hitting, and you need to essentially with VC funding make a return for them. The horizon used to be like 7 to 10 years. Now it's like within 5 to 7 years, you need to basically make their money back for them. And so like you're immediately thrown in it. For me, someone who I don't have a footwear development background. I knew it was going to be a bit of a learning curve. If I took that money in March of 2020, I think it would have been a process where I was learning along the way and then having the pressure of VC to perform, right? And that would have just not have been the best combination. So I think me taking this year, figuring it all out, so that when I am ready to go back out to VC, I don't feel that like compounded pressure of having to deliver against their metrics. I think in an ideal world, it'd be like wonderful to bootstrap this, but as you know, footwear development is so capital intensive. I'm still self-funded at the moment. So you just kind of have to do like this pre-order model or kind of like the batch system of getting your shoes out.
Yeah. Where, so, and again, you mentioned this offline to me. I think your shoes are meant to arrive in the near future.
Mm-hmm.
What's kind of the next like major stage gate for you in the brand, right? So that you're going to get the product out to the consumers, you know, hopefully they love it, right?
Yeah.
You get all that data and that feedback, but like, what's like the next major milestone that you're trying to go after?
Yeah, I think for me, it's like just focusing, like better understand like the consumer needs, right? Like I think for the most part, we know what women have been asking for. I think the bigger brands even know what women are asking for. Yeah. So I think it's really gauging like how they respond to the first product. You know, I'm sure there's going to be like materials improvements that we need to make. There's going to be feedback. Like again, I'm a product management person, so we constantly iterate based on a feedback loop, right? So after surveying the consumers who purchase and asking them what can be improved upon, and then going back to the factory and saying, hey, like this is what we need to change, or this is how the style needs to improve, or 2.0 version when we release it. We already have kind of colorways designed. I would love to introduce a new tooling as a second style, maybe next year. But I think it's just kind of like, it's kind of just like proof of concept, right? Like, is this what people are craving, especially in a world where we're so used to a hyper masculine view of the sneaker world? I didn't share too much of this, but like Lilith is really kind of tapping into like the divine feminine, into like that story of, you know, women expressing their sexuality and gender on a spectrum. And it doesn't have to necessarily be a tomboy persona. You can be hyper feminine or hyper masculine, and that's all accepted in the world of Lilith. And so I think for me, that's kind of, it's a lot of storytelling. I think for me, I think that's kind of the next step, is being able to just share out the story of Lilith and kind of how we're kind of going to stand out a little differently than some of the other traditional sneaker brands.
Super cool. Where does the name Lilith come from? I was always super curious about that. Like, what does it mean? What is it? So
when I was having this whole like decision of wanting to start a business, like in 2015, my sister brought up the name. So Lilith in folklore, in Jewish folklore and Middle Eastern folklore, she was actually Adam's first wife. It's not Eve. And Lilith was written out of history because she chose not to be submissive to Adam. And male scholars have really written her off as kind of like a demon, a baby snatcher, a woman of the night. And they kind of just changed her entire story. But like for us, she's really self-actualized. She's living her truth. And she's actually over time become like a feminist icon in that realm. But she has a lot of parallels to the story of like Kali Ma in Hinduism. Like, you know, she's a goddess. She's very powerful. She's like of like motherly love and like feminine. And so there's just been like a lot of parallels with some of the different icons that you'll see in our branding. And so Lilith actually stemmed from that storytelling. So I thought that was just apt, like given how kind of women have been kind of not been able to really show up in sneaker culture. I felt like Lilith was someone who can be seen as that self-actualized person, and her story is quite similar.
I've never heard that story, and I'm super stoked that I asked that question, because it's such a unique word, and now understanding the story behind it, it's even cooler, and it's easy to remember. Yeah, it's like short and sweet, and like it's just so unique and powerful that I was like, I've never heard or seen this word before. Yeah. And maybe to your point, because it's been written off.
It's been written off. But it's funny because I actually didn't know who she was. My sister was the one who really briefed me on her. But there are times where I'm actually sharing the story with women and they're like, yeah, I know Lilith. Of course, like you have Lilith Fair, like back in the day with the music group. And so people have, I guess I live under a rock, but people have known about the pop culture references. And so they get excited when I tell them that. They're like, oh, that's a great name. But I had to learn it myself. I guess my sister was the one who told me about it.
That's awesome. I'm super excited to see what you do over the next coming months, especially after we get the product. And I was a consumer. I bought them.
Yes, thank you so much.
For so my mom for Mother's Day, but they kind of got delayed. I keep telling every time I see my mom, I'm like, I promise I spent the money on you, Mom. I swear to God.
I did write her a note because I actually wrote all my note cards for the pre-orders. Are ready to ship as soon as they land. They just left the factory this weekend. There was like insane delays. I can't even start. But yeah, I'm excited to get the shoes into the folks who ordered in January. So thank you again. I hope your mom loves them.
Yeah, I'm sure she will. It's super interesting. So I've two more questions for you.
Yeah.
The first one, where can people follow your journey, the brand's journey? What's the easiest way to get in touch and things like that? I know you are fairly responsive, so where can people follow along?
So Lilith.nyc is the website. So it's LILITH.nyc. That's the URL. Same for the Instagram handle. You can contact me at sarah@lilith.nyc or sarah.sukumaran@gmail. Either way.
Super cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. Direct email, folks. Go check out the product if you like it, buy it. Are you still accepting orders, or was it kind of like a one-off thing?
No, it was actually open for quite a bit, but I just closed the site, made it private because I'm just updating with new photo assets. Like we did the product photography and the branding stuff. So just kind of like gearing up for launch in the coming month and a half.
Well, when they reopen, folks, reopen, go check it out and buy a pair. Last question. I like to end kind of on a advice segment of like, you've obviously have a ton of experience in a lot of different spaces. You've gone through hurdles in different areas of the world and with different brands, major brands. What's like the biggest piece of advice you'd give to anybody who's thinking about starting their own thing, or just thinking about doing something for themselves, or just any advice in general that you'd leave with somebody?
I think a couple of things. One, I think definitely try to do it if you can. I think the biggest regret, like in 2015, even when I started those Instagram accounts, I bought the domain. Every day I'd wake up and have regret not doing something. Like I knew I wanted to take a step forward, but I would just kind of sit on it and it would eat away at me. So I would say, like, if you have a desire to start something, just start a blog, start an Instagram account, just take that leap. Two, I think is something that people don't really talk about, but it's the financial means that you need to do to prepare to start a business. Because the reality is, it is capital intensive, especially if you're trying to start a footwear company. And I don't think people are quite open about sharing that experience of having to use your savings, or, you know, if you're going out for external investment, it's really take stock of like what you're able to do in the short term, so that you're not going broke, that you're not kind of breaking the bank completely, but really like financially plan. Like for me, for example, I knew that I can not have to work full time, right? Like I knew that I can take that time off, but for some, and sometimes I rethink, I'm like, why did I quit my job? Like maybe I should take another job, right? Like just to make sure that you have that passive income coming in. So just really taking stock of like, you don't necessarily have to quit your full-time job, right? Because I did that because obviously it would have been a conflict of interest if I stayed. But you can definitely do things as a side hustle. And I think sometimes people don't talk about the financial implications of like starting a business, especially if you don't have a spouse, or partner who can support you. Like I'm in this literally on my own, and I don't think people kind of really openly talk about how they financially make things happen. And so I try to be transparent about that.
Well, we appreciate you being transparent about that. I think that's a hell of a segment and of advice. So hopefully people gain value out of that. I know I definitely did. I know we chat a little bit offline here and there, but thank you for actually spending the time to kind of deep dive into your past and your story. And I'm excited. Maybe one day we'll have you back on after a couple of years of hopeful success for Lilith.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So I'm excited. Thanks so much, Sarah. This has been a blast. I wish you a ton of success, and I can't wait to see the product.
Thank you, David. Appreciate you having me today.